Okay, today is November the 22nd, 2021. My name is Tanya Finchum, and I'm with Oklahoma State University. I am in Edmond, Oklahoma to speak with Ben Pollard, former Assistant Director of the Oklahoma Conservation Commission, who served in that position from 1991 until his retirement in 2014. Prior to that, from 1978 to 1980, Ben was the Commission's planning assistant. He worked in the Commission's abandoned mine land reclamation program from 1981 until becoming assistant director. And in 2017, Ben was inducted into the Oklahoma Conservation Hall of Fame. In 2009, he was named Natural Resources Conservation Service Conservationist of the Year. And in 2014, he received the Lifetime Achievement Award from Keep Oklahoma Beautiful. To borrow a quote from the late Mike Thralls, former executive director of the Conservation Commission, for over 3 decades, Ben has been integral to the causes of conserving, protecting, and restoring Oklahoma's natural resources. This interview will be part of our Oklahoma's Conservation Heritage Oral History Project, which is a collaboration between the Oklahoma Conservation Historical Society, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program. So thank you for talking with me today. That was a lot, so thank you.
Thank you, Tanya.
Before we get started with your conservation work, let's learn a little bit about you. Start wherever you like.
Well, thank you. I'd like to start by saying that I've been working with the Conservation Historical Society for the past 4 years, and it's been our pleasure to work with Oklahoma State University on this Conservation Heritage Oral History Collection. So we appreciate all the work from you, Tanya, and the staff at OSU. I think we've now have 35 interviews on the OSU Library's website and 12 more in the works. And our board is hoping that we can have 50 here in the next couple of years. So that's our plan, and it's been a wonderful project, and we appreciate all of your hard work and the staff at OSU's Oral History Research Program. So with that, I would like to start from the beginning, which was I was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1953. And considering that I worked for the conservation for 35 years, nothing in my background would ever have made anyone imagine that I would work in an organization primarily with farmers and landowners in rural Oklahoma. So I'll give you a little bit of my background. My father was a research chemist in Tulsa at Pan American Oil Company, and he was an OU graduate. He grew up in Lamont, Oklahoma, a wheat town in Grant County, so he had a bit of a rural background. And my grandfather in Lamont was a wheat broker for the local grain elevator, and my grandmother ran a hatchery raising chicks that she sold, and it was right there on their property in the town of Lamont. And my mother grew up in rural Oklahoma in Blackwell, and she was an OSU graduate, or I should say an Oklahoma A&M graduate. And she was in business education. And my grandfather in Blackwell was a physician, and my grandmother was a nurse. And 3 of my 4 grandparents did grow up on farms, and that's my connection to the land, but it's a couple of generations removed. So in Tulsa, I went to elementary school there in the Tulsa public school system till I was in 2nd grade. And my passions were baseball primarily and other sports and being outside. My parents were avid gardeners, both flowers and vegetable gardens. So we spent a lot of time working in the garden. And my father was a beekeeper, so he had some connection with farmers on putting his hives out and about. So I had that connection to the outdoors. And in 1961, we moved to Ponca City, where my father started working for Continental Oil Company. So in 1961, I started the 3rd grade in Ponca City. And I would say I was very fortunate for many reasons to have moved to Ponca. At the time, it was the corporate headquarters for Continental Oil Company. And they brought in people, professionals from all over the United States to work there. My father worked in the research and development division. And so there was a real emphasis in Ponca City from folks moving in from around the country on education and a good school system. And I didn't really fully appreciate how good my education was until I went off to college. But I had the good fortune, in retrospect, of growing up in Ponca City. I would say that coming of age in the 1960s, it was a turbulent time in the country. My father was an avid reader and interested in national and local events, and started every day reading the newspaper. He would read the Newsweek magazine cover to cover. And so I guess maybe modeled that as well. And I had a lot of interest in local events. And of course, in the 1960s, there were lots of local events and national events to keep track of. And that, interestingly enough, we're doing this interview on the 22nd of November, which is when John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. And I was 10 years old at the time, and remember vividly teachers coming into our classroom to talk about that. And so from that point forward in the 60s, we also had the Vietnam War, we had the Civil Rights Movement, we had the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. We had lots of urban riots and cities burning, and it was that was the backdrop that I grew up in. But in Ponca City, it was a lot calmer than that, and it was a good place to grow up. And I was fortunate to have good friends there that were very interested in education and were stimulated me to work hard in school and do some things like that. So the other things I would point out about Ponca City and growing up is my mother was a piano player and insisted that I be a piano player from the time I was 6. And so I took piano lessons for 8 years, and I was not the greatest student of the piano. She made me practice 30 minutes every day. She would put a timer on the piano, and as soon as that bell went off, I'd be back outside playing baseball or hanging out with my friends. But in retrospect, it's been a lifelong hobby that I've enjoyed and have taken up again as an adult. But when I was 14, I convinced her that I would continue my music by becoming a electric organ player in a rock and roll band. And somehow she believed that and allowed me to stop taking piano lessons. And I got my first job at the A&W Root Beer Drive-In as a 14-year-old car hop so I could earn money to buy my organ and become a rock and roll star. And I can tell you, Tanya, that everyone should be a car hop or work in a restaurant. It's a humbling experience. And this particular drive-in is where all the high school kids hung out. And when you work a 7-hour shift on a Friday from 5 to 12 and receive continuous insults from 17-year-olds that are driving through the drive-in, it did humble me to realize that I needed to find something else to do besides work in the service industry. I did become a rock and roll star. All my friends in Ponca would agree with that. I was in the band called The Dimensions. We considered ourselves a legendary band. We didn't make much money, but we had a good time. I can tell you my first rock and roll experience is playing in a band at the Sonic Drive-In, and I believe we were paid with hamburgers and soft drinks. So the other highlights from my days in Ponca City include being part of the Ponca City High School Big Blue Band, and in 1969, in January, we had been the band selected from Oklahoma to march in Richard M. Nixon's inaugural parade in Washington. And I would say that God bless the people that were the adult sponsors of a band that had 200 members in it, taking that big a crowd to Washington, D.C., or that many kids to Washington, D.C. for the inaugural parade. So that was certainly a memorable experience getting to participate in that. And then a few friends in the conservation movement and friends of mine in Ponca City would uh, make sure that they wanted me to get in the historic record that one of my first leadership positions was as the president of the Frisbee Club my senior year in high school in Ponca City. It was, certainly in my view, perhaps the most important and most interesting club that we had in high school, and we did sponsor a Frisbee festival at the end of my senior year that, by all accounts, was one of the finest events that we had at Ponca City High School. So there was nothing in my background in Ponca City that would lead me to be a conservationist, although I would share that by the late 1960s, there was a lot of interest in the environment in this country. And I believe one of the events that occurred that has always been a watershed moment for me in thinking about our environment was in 1969, I believe it was, when the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio, caught fire and made a lot of national news, and really was an emphasis, or it was a moment in our nation when folks realized that water pollution had become a huge issue when we can have rivers actually catch fire. And that has always remained one of the things I think about as what started pointing me into the direction of the environment and conservation. The other good fortune I had as a child growing up, and I should mention that I was the only child of Bill and Betty Pollard, and I'm not sure the whole story behind that, but being an only child in the 50s and 60s was kind of an unusual thing. And but on the good side of that, I wanted to mention that I got to travel all around the country as a child. My father loved to camp, and so my real first experience with conservation has to do with visiting national parks and national forests throughout the western U.S. And the first fish I ever caught, I think I was 5 or 6 years old in Glacier National Park, and I had the good fortune of visiting Rocky Mountain National Park, the Grand Canyon, Mount Rainier, Yosemite, and it did leave a lasting impression on me on the value and importance and the beauty that we have on our public lands. But even though I really enjoyed that, none of that really prepared me for conservation on private lands, but it did have an influence on my career. After high school, I went to school at the University of Oklahoma, mainly because most of my good friends in high school chose the University of Oklahoma. I didn't really have a very good idea of what I wanted to do. I was very interested in public policy and public events and political science and history. And at that time, it was it was an idealistic time for 18-year-olds in 1971. And so I really always viewed myself as going into the public sector. I never really had a lot of thought or interest in going into business or private sector. That had always been that's kind of how I guess, viewed the world after high school. So I didn't really have a good idea of what I would major in. I was all over the map. I thought it would be practical to get a teaching certificate, to have that as a backup if I needed a job. So I took some education courses. I was very interested in history. But then I ended up, one of the resident advisors in one of the dorms that I was in urban and regional planning graduate program at OU. And I talked with him quite a bit and got very interested, thought that would be maybe a direction I should go. So I ended up with an unusual major of urban studies, which involved economics, political science and public administration, and geography. And it was really the geography part that I was most interested in, and had some really good professors, one of which was really interested in environmental issues and got me involved in in an environmental student group at OU. And it was a group that was started the first campus recycling, and this would have been about 1973. And at this point, I need to mention a gentleman by the name of Fenton Rood. Fenton was my age, and he was really the leader of this group that started the recycling. And even as a 19 or 20-year-old, Fenton knew more about recycling and solid waste management than probably most professionals in Oklahoma. And I would say Fenton continued his career, and I got to work with him for some 35 or 40 years. He was in solid waste management for the Department of Environmental Quality, just retired here this year. And Fenton's been an important part of my life because he's also mentored both my two children that also have gone into the environmental field. And most importantly, as Fenton likes to point out from time to time, it was because of this environmental group on campus that I met my wife, and we met actually on a recycling truck. So she was a freshman and I was a junior. So I needed to shout out to Fenton for really helping me gain an interest in the environment, as also for all that he's done for me personally. So it was a turbulent time in the early 1970s. When you're 18 years old in 1971, the Vietnam War was still going on. We were still getting draft numbers, and that was big on every 18-year-old male's mind at the time. I had the good fortune of having draft number 234, so I wasn't called up for induction, but I did have some friends with low numbers that did get to go to the pre-induction physical. And the war left a lasting mark on me as far as the government and our family. My uncle was in the United States Air Force and was shot down in Laos and was missing in action for some 20 years before they found his plane and remains. And so it had a profound effect on certainly his family and my cousins, and a lasting impression on me as well. So anyway, that was kind of my time at the University of Oklahoma, getting interested in environmental matters, taking some courses that really got me interested in that. And then I'd made the decision I wanted to go to graduate school in urban and regional planning, and I decided I'd lived in Oklahoma my whole life and that it would probably be good to go to someplace completely different. And certainly I went to someplace completely different, the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where I was in the urban and regional planning school there. And I went there for 1 year, and I was very interested in environmental. So a lot of the classes I took were more environmental resource planning than they were urban planning. So I got some very good coursework there. And I got an internship that summer in Hot Springs, Arkansas. This was 1976. Spent the summer there. And that was the summer that my wife, then girlfriend, she had transferred to OSU, and she was in wildlife management. And she got an internship at the Oklahoma Conservation Commission. And I had never heard of the Oklahoma Conservation Commission, and I don't believe she had either. And she just happened to look for a summer job by checking with various state agencies that might be interested. She was in wildlife management, but her minor was in communications and journalism. And so she walked in cold to the Conservation Commission office in the basement of the Capitol and got to talk to the executive director, Leonard A. Solomon. And he decided that he would hire her as a summer intern to do writing and some various feature pieces on conservation in Oklahoma. And if that hadn't happened, there would be no career for me in conservation, because by the end of the summer, I had got a chance to meet some of the other people on staff at the commission since she was working there, and they had just started a water quality program. And there were 2 new employees that were just kind of getting the program up and running, and they happened to need some additional help. And I decided, well, here's a great opportunity for me to be closer to home and my girlfriend and get some good experience in environmental things. And I could still take some graduate courses at OU and continue to pursue my master's degree. So I went to work at the Conservation Commission as an intern and spent a year or so doing that, working in the first year or 2 of the water quality program, and pursued my master's degree with some coursework at OU. And then in 1977 and 78, I changed gears and went to work as a planner at the Northern Oklahoma Development Association in Enid, Oklahoma, and spent a year and a half or so working with small communities with planning and other city issues. And I would just share that it was exciting for me. I got to work in my father's hometown of Lamont, helping them update their town ordinances. And then I also was on the team that did the comprehensive plan for the city of Blackwell, where my mother and grandparents had been. So it was an area of the state that I knew, and I got to work in some communities and work in those places where my family was from. So anyway, I got a call back from the commission in 1978, and they said they were interested in hiring me back as a staff person in a position called the planning assistant. And I decided that I would go back and do that. Laura, my girlfriend, was just finishing up her degree at OSU, so that gave us a chance to be a little bit closer. And I went back to work as a planning assistant, and I should share this story. The Conservation Commission had perhaps the worst offices I can ever describe. They were in the basement of the Capitol with no windows, with pipes around in the ceilings, bad lighting, just awful offices is the best way to describe them. But Leonard Solomon, the executive director, wanted to be in the Capitol. And the reason is that he was one of the finest political operators I've ever seen. And the door to the Conservation Commission just happened to be in the hallway where the senators all walked in every morning, as well as the governor. And so here he was, always available at any time to visit with a senator or the governor or the staff as they walked down the hall. And it was just right around the corner from the Capitol cafeteria. So he could hold court there with various political folks at any time of the day when they'd come down to the cafeteria. So he wanted to stay in that office till the very end, and in fact we were the last agency without a state elected official that continued to have a office in the Capitol. So we finally moved to the Ag Building in 1981. So anyway, I started my career as the planning assistant. At the time, there were only 8 full-time employees at the Conservation Commission, and then a couple of contract environmental or water quality employees. So maybe 10 or 12 people in the office, and it was strictly an administrative position or agency of directing state funds to our conservation districts. So that's how I got my start, and as I said, I really owe it all to my wife for getting me networked into this agency. I don't believe in today's world I would have had the qualifications that would have interested most administrators in hiring me into this particular kind of agency, but apparently I'd done well enough as an intern that they wanted me back. So that's how I got my start at the commission. Can we take a little break right here?
Sure.
Okay, well, I would share that I started full-time with the commission in 1978 as the planning assistant, and I still hadn't finished my master's degree, and I worked for 9 months or so as planning assistant, and I had the good fortune of the executive director, Leonard A. Solomon, granting me a 4-month leave of absence. So I returned for the winter of 1979 to Madison and finished my master's degree, graduating in May of '79. And that was, in retrospect, a very generous thing for Mr. Solomon to do, to advance my career and save my job or keep it open at the Conservation Commission so that I could return and work there in 1979. In the summer, I returned. And then after some 5 or 6 years of a long distance relationship with my girlfriend Laura, we ended up getting married in December of 1979. So again, she was and is responsible for really my conservation career, of getting me connected with the Conservation Commission and what turned out to be a 35-year career at the commission. I should mention that the 70s were an important time in environmental legislation nationally. In 1970, I was still in high school. That was the first Earth Day. The Environmental Protection Agency was created in 1970. The Clean Water Act, the Federal Clean Water Act, was passed in 1972 when I was a freshman in college, and that was actually, the funding came through for my first job at the commission, was environmental protection money for water quality that the commission received the grant for, that I worked on in 1976. And then in 1977, the Congress passed the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, which provided federal legislation to regulate coal mines and also provided funding to clean up abandoned coal mines around the country. And interestingly, the Department of Mines in Oklahoma is responsible for mining regulation, but there were some conservation district folks in eastern Oklahoma that had coal mining concerns and issues with what had been going on, and they worked very hard with Mr. Solomon, our executive director, to convince him that the commission should be responsible to reclaim the abandoned mines in Oklahoma, because, as they pointed out, working with Soil Conservation Service and what we did on the land, we're really better equipped to do mine reclamation. And so, because of Mr. Solomon's political savvy, he was able to convince the legislature and the governor that, yes, the Conservation Commission should be responsible for this program through the Department of the Interior. And in 1981, that program became operational at the Conservation Commission. And the assistant director at the time, Mike Castle, decided he would like to run that program, get it started. And a little bit later, in '81, I moved over from planning assistant to work and get that program started. And I worked in that program for basically 10 years at the commission. I'm quite proud of the work that the staff and the conservation districts did. We've reclaimed thousands of acres of dangerous high walls, gob piles, spoil piles that were not vegetated, and also underground mines that had caved in, causing hazards in some of the communities in eastern Oklahoma. It was my job was to work with landowners to clear sites for reclamation, to do the environmental assessments that were required for each project. We did a lot, and I did a lot of inventory work. We had to inventory all the sites and determine which ones were most hazardous and needed in the most need of reclamation, that that provided the biggest danger to the public. And it was a very rewarding position because I worked on the front end of these projects before reclamation, and then we had an engineer that managed the construction contracts, and then vegetation folks that did the vegetation inspection, and so I got to see a project through from the beginning to see how it looked a few years later when it was reclaimed, and it's still very rewarding to go back in some of the places in eastern Oklahoma now, 30 years after the fact, and see how well these sites have held up and how good they look, and you wouldn't even know that they'd ever been a mine before. So it was a very rewarding job, and I enjoyed it immensely. I got to travel a lot in eastern Oklahoma, spent a lot of time with conservation district offices that assisted with helping us select projects. And anyway, it was a very rewarding career. And then out of the clear blue in 1991, Mason Mungle, the executive director, for reasons only he could probably share, decided that we had a vacancy as the assistant director position in the agency, and he wanted me to be the assistant director. And it was an unclassified position, which meant it didn't have to go through the merit system of advertising and bringing in lots of applicants. So he basically selected me for that position. And probably one of the more interesting experiences for me was he introduced me to the commission, 5 commissioners, at a meeting in May of 1991, and said that he had selected me as the assistant director. And one of the commissioners had no idea even who I was, even though I'd worked for the agency for 10 or 12 years, because I was not on the management team that attended commission meetings. So that was the start, one of my favorite remembrances of becoming the assistant director. So that's kind of my history at the commission, getting it to the assistant director position. So now I think I would like to share my observations about the commission from the time I started working there until leaving at the end of 2013, start of 2014. It needs to be said that the organization of the Conservation Commission, I think, was really well thought through by the legislature back in the day. There are 5 commissioners that are appointed by the governor that serve as the governing board. And there are 5 distinct areas of the state that they represent. And the most important thing that was in the legislation was that to be a commissioner, you have to be a conservation district director, which means that the governor can only appoint someone that has some real life understanding of conservation at the local level. So all of the commissioners that I ever worked with, while they are governor appointees, they are also connected with their local conservation district, and so they are very aware of anything that we would do at the commission had an impact at the local level, and they had to live with that as well as a district director. The other thing that was important, is important still, is that the governor only appoints 1 commissioner each year. They serve 5-year terms. So the governor does not have the ability to hire and fire the executive director. They're hired by the commissioners, and it takes 3 years for the governor, if he wants to remove an executive director, to appoint his people to the commission. So in a lot of ways, during my 30 plus years, the commission was given the authority and had the authority to hire and fire executive directors, and there wasn't a lot of governor influence trying to tell commissioners to get rid of or to hire this person as executive director. So that's another real positive that I see in the way that the commission is formed, and remains this day, that you have to be a district director to be a commissioner. I would also share that when you look at the photos of the commissioners that have served from the 1940s till present day, the first 50 years, all commissioners were white males, and there wasn't much diversity or any diversity in the commission. And I would share this story from the 1990s, 1992, I believe it was. I was serving, I'd just been assistant director for a year or so, and I happened to know Governor Walter's chief of staff. We went to the same church together, and so out of the clear blue one day, he called me up and said, Ben, the governor wants to appoint a woman to the Area 3 commissioner position. It was the one that was coming open. And I explained to him, well, that's fine, but there's only a limited pool of women that are even conservation district directors in Area 3, which is the northeast part of the state. And he said, that's fine, so send me a list of those that are eligible to be appointed. And as I recall, we sent a list of 3 women. There may have been 4 or 5, but there were 3 that were active conservation district directors that we felt like had the ability to do the job. And they called all of them, interviewed them all, and selected Sandra Drummond from Osage County Conservation District as the first female commissioner. And she served for 10 years, 2 terms, and I believe was reappointed by Governor Keating for her second 5-year term. So that was the first effort of getting some diversity on the commission. And interestingly enough, by the late 1990s, Sandra was still serving on the commission, and Governor Keating, over the course of a couple of years, appointed 2 more women to the commission. So in the late 90s, early 2000s, we actually had a majority of the 5 were female commissioners, which I can tell you was a pretty remarkable development, because out of the 440 some district directors at the time, less than 40 were women. So you can imagine that was it was quite a change for our organization to move to that kind of system. So the other things that are important for me to share about the commission are the executive directors that I worked with. As I was preparing for this interview, I realized that since 1971, there have only been 4 executive directors of the commission in 50 years, which is really remarkable for a state agency, many of which have political appointees and directors that just serve for a short time. But in 71, Leonard A. Solomon became executive director, served for some 15 years. And I would share with everyone that he was a remarkable and charismatic leader. I learned a lot from him. He was the kind of individual that when you went into his office, you were the most important person in the room, and he made you feel like you could do anything. Very supportive, a mentor to many, many people. He was an incredible political operative. He loved politics. He loved working with elected representatives. He was a great speaker. He was funny. He was just a charismatic guy. And one of the things I'll always remember about him is that every week he would write a letter to someone in the conservation movement, a director, an employee, a Soil Conservation Service federal employee, thanking them and encouraging them for the work they did. And it was a great lesson that I wish I'd done more in my own career, but that was the kind of guy he was. Um, he loved people. He loved conservation. He was passionate about it. He wanted things to happen on the ground, and I was fortunate that my career started with him and all the lessons that he taught. And then the second executive director that I worked with was Mason Mungle, and I felt I felt it was tough for Mason because he was following a legend, and you never like to follow a legend, in my view, whether it's a football coach or anything in profession where you've got a legend. And Leonard Solomon was a legend, but Mason had grown up on a dairy farm. His grandfather, had been a commissioner on the Conservation Commission. Mason was a district director in Atoka. He got interested and was in the State Association of Conservation Districts as a board member. He was appointed as a commissioner by Governor Nye. So he was well equipped to become the executive director and served in that capacity in just a fantastic way for 10 years. I owe a lot of my career to Mason, obviously, for selecting me as assistant director. The thing that Mason needs to be remembered for, amongst many things, is that he went to bat for Conservation District employees. They did not have benefits like health insurance or retirement, and we can talk about that a little bit about why that happened. But in the late 80s and early 90s, he was able to get district employees into the state insurance program and health insurance program, as well as retirement, which made it a lot easier to attract people and keep people working at conservation districts. So Mason deserves most of the credit for sticking with that issue and making it happen, and bringing district employees up to a status that they deserved as fully benefited employees. Then I got to work with Mike Thralls. He was selected when Mason moved to work for the Farmers Union. Mike Thralls came on in the late 90s, and he was a dairy farmer from the Billings area in Noble County. And he had been this was in the Keating administration. He had been the assistant director at the Department of Ag, and had a chance to work with Mason. And so Mason recommended to the commission that Mike become the executive director, and he was selected and served some 15, 17 years. The rest of my career, I worked with Mike, and I can only say that he was a man of great personal integrity, great passion for conservation, really worked extremely hard to advance the organization. And I was proud to work for him. I was proud to work for all three of these executive directors. Count them all as personal friends and mentors, and the historic record needs to show that they were passionate about conservation, the importance it is to the state of Oklahoma, and always put the best interests of the agency and the people that worked in the agency first. So it was my great fortune that I got to work with all three of them. And then I should say, while I haven't had a chance to work under the current executive director, who's been there now 7 years, Trey Lamb, I did get to work with him when he was the president of the state association. And Trey really continues the legacy of outstanding directors at the Conservation Commission. And I'm proud of the work he's done. He's advanced the agency, in my view, quite well since I left, and it's in great hands. And so that's a brief 50-year review of the four conservation commission executive directors that I've had the privilege to work with. We mentioned the commissioners, and I should say how much I appreciated all of the commissioners just for their dedication to the job. Not only were they going to monthly meetings and managing their local conservation districts as public officials, but they were coming to the Conservation Commission for monthly board meetings. Great dedication, having to learn all the ins and outs of an agency and help manage it. It truly a challenge, and really dedicated folks. I would share my favorite story is about Hal Clark, who served as commissioner for close to 20 years under, I believe, 4 different governors at least. Hal had a ranch in Cimarron County, actually adjacent to Colorado. That's how far out in the panhandle it was. And he was the Area 1 commissioner. And our commission meeting started at 9:30 in the morning on Monday. And all my years working with Hal, generally, he was the first commission member there, never late. And usually he drove in from either the panhandle at his ranch northwest of Boise City or from Guyman, and go home after the commission meeting. And again, as I said, he was never late, always there. And it was just remarkable that of that kind of dedication. And I counted Hal as a great friend and conservationist and a wonderful representative of the Panhandle for the years he served on the commission. And I could tell stories about all of the commissioners and their dedication. It was, I always tried to remind myself as a paid employee, whether I was working with our commissioners or conservation district employees or district directors, that these folks were not getting paid for what they were doing. They were spending literally hours and hours and hours each month promoting conservation, and that I needed to remember that at all times. These folks were spending a lot of their free time because they were dedicated to advancing conservation. Now I'd like to talk about conservation district employees a little bit, and a little bit of that history. When I joined the agency in the late 70s and the early 80s, out in the conservation districts, there were conservation offices that had NRCS, or at that time Soil Conservation Service federal employees, and then most offices had a district secretary. And the arrangement was the Soil Conservation Service paid half the salary and the district paid the other half, and they got their money through state appropriations. So these employees were basically managed primarily by the local SCS district conservationist, who was the lead for that agency in the local offices. And sometime in the 80s, the Soil Conservation Service decided to eliminate those half-time positions. And so there was a transition period, and these half-time employees became full-time conservation district employees, paid in full by mostly reimbursements from the state. And that was a challenging time because suddenly conservation district board members were the responsible personnel managers for this employee, that no longer were they to answer to, or that the local federal employee had management responsibilities, evaluation, and that sort of thing. And that was a long and rocky transition in conservation because you had every sort of arrangement out in local offices where some of the federal employees continued to think they were in charge of that employee and could manage them, and you had others that had complete hands-off, no, the local board's in charge. So that remained a sticking point for many years. I I spent my whole career trying to lift up district employees to be fully appreciated professionals in the local offices. And that was a big challenge because the Soil Conservation Service, despite this being called a conservation partnership of the state, the feds, and the local, they were the big dogs in the local office. They had the money, the resources. They had the federal employee salaries that were quite a bit better than state and local salaries for employees. So it was a long transition, getting district employees trained, believing in themselves, having district directors manage them in a professional way. And so I'm really proud of the fact that over the course of my career, these employees, I think, have a lot more self-esteem about their abilities, about the work they did, and that we tried our best to improve their salaries and their benefits. And that was hard because we depended on the legislature always providing the money for their salaries. And there were many years when there were no adjustments in salary from the state, whereas the federal government employees usually got a cost of living raise every year. So it was a hard battle. And in the early 1990s, the district employees formed an employee association, which was quite a watershed event too. And there was a lot of hand-wringing about that there were some directors and other staff that thought that this was going to be some sort of labor union and were really adamantly opposed to it. But some of the leaders at that time in the district employees movement were savvy enough to say, no, we're doing this for education of the legislature, but also as a professional development organization for our employees. And it's been in existence now for 30 years, and they have been a positive influence on the employees and have had a positive influence educating the legislature about their position and their need to be compensated as state employees are compensated. So I'm particularly proud of some of those district employees that had the courage really to be leaders and get this organization off the ground and make it a positive influence for everyone. And now let me talk about the NRCS, or the Old Soil Conservation Service, because this was a learning experience for me, coming into an organization where I didn't know the lay of the land very well. And for anybody looking in from the outside, this is a hard structure to understand, because you have the federal government, the Soil Conservation Service, you have state government, the Conservation Commission, and you have local government, the local conservation districts, and they're all partnering to put conservation on the ground. And anyway, when you walk into a local office, you might be talking to a local employee or a federal employee, or in a few cases, even a state employee. And the NRCS, in the late 70s, early 80s, when I joined, the commission was a very structured in a very military way, top down. You have a state conservationist in Stillwater, you had a next layer of middle management called area conservationists, and you had district conservationists at the local level in the local office. And it was a top-down hierarchy. And I would share one of the first experiences I had. I was sent out as a planning assistant to a county or a district office in western Oklahoma by Mr. Solomon to work on an issue. I can't remember what it was, but all I remember is I talked to the local district conservationists and the local employees. And when I got back to Oklahoma City, the area conservationist who supervised the local district conservationists, had already called Mr. Solomon and complained that I had failed to notify him that I was coming into his area or his little kingdom in western Oklahoma. And that I realized then that the Soil Conservation Service were the big dogs at that time, and that we all had to kind of play to their fiddler. And anyway, it was a sobering experience and one that I have always remembered. In fact, I believe we have interviewed Kevin Norton of the NRCS, and a longtime friend of mine. Kevin became the state conservationist in Louisiana, and I had told him this story. And so anytime that I ever drove through Louisiana, I would always call Kevin and advise him that I was in his kingdom in Louisiana. I just wanted to let him know that I was there. I was not on business, but so anyway, I've had fun with that story for a long time. But it was a learning experience for me. The Soil Conservation Service and now NRCS has changed dramatically over time. When I started working, they had some 550 employees in Oklahoma, and now I believe about half or less than that in 2021. So they had 550 employees. The Conservation Commission had about 10, and districts had those half-time employees. So there were really maybe 150 or so conservation district employees. So they were clearly running the show. And I don't mean this in a derogatory way, because they have wonderful people that were doing wonderful work and great conservation, but while it was a partnership, it was not an equal partnership. And I spent much of my career trying to bring the commission staff and conservation district employees into a full partnership with the Soil Conservation Service, or now NRCS folks. And I think we made great strides in that way. And I'll share a little more about that after a quick break.
Okay.
Well, I'd like to start back up by talking a little bit about transitioning to the assistant director position. I'd worked 10 years in abandoned mine land reclamation, a specific program where you were focused on projects and completing projects. And then I transitioned to the assistant director position, and it was completely different than the job I've been doing. Instead of focusing on one thing on any given day, I might have a call from a legislative staffer asking about the budget. I may have a call from a district director with a personnel matter with a district employee, maybe holding a staff meeting with water quality staff. So it was a whole new experience for me, being able to try to understand that on any given day, some sort of amazing issue or problem might arise. And so you're constantly bouncing around from issue to issue. So I had to learn to deal with that over my 20 plus years as the assistant director. And it was a challenge, and always was a challenge. But at the same time, there were really never a dull moment being the assistant director, because you were dealing with all sorts of issues. And then I should share that I've been asked many times over the course of my career, did you ever wish to be or were considered to be the executive director of the agency? And I would say that when Mason Mungle told me that he was going to leave the commission as executive director and move to a position at the Farmers Union, he encouraged me to consider being the executive director, and I appreciated the fact that he had that confidence in me that he would ask me to do that. But at the time, I had two fairly young children at home, and I knew to do the job of executive director really required 100% all-in willingness to travel around the state, be on the road a lot, dealing with the legislature as the point person for the agency, and being the out front face of the agency. And I realized I was really more equipped to be the behind the scenes, working on problems, supporting the director. And most importantly, I did not have the background in agriculture as the previous directors had. And because much of our clientele and directors were active farmers, I didn't really feel like I could connect well enough on that level that could gain their confidence in the role of director. So after some thought, I decided that staying on as the assistant director was really the best spot for me. So at this point, I would like to go over some of what I see as some of the major things that happened at the commission over my career. I'd like to start back in the 80s when we started to have, I was working in mine reclamation at the time, we had a small staff, and so we all worked on a lot of different things. And one of the ideas we hatched is that the commission needed its own cost share program with state funds, like many states had, that districts could set their own priorities and put conservation on the land with state funds. And we worked and actually got some legislation passed authorizing us to have a cost share program, but it never got funded throughout the 1980s. But later, we'll talk about when the cost share program did become a reality with funding at the commission. But that whole idea was hatched back in the early 80s. I would share that one of the watershed events in conservation in Oklahoma was 1985, the federal farm bill, that fundamentally changed some of the things that the Soil Conservation Service was doing on the ground. And that was Congress decided that there was still too much erosion going on. There was issues with wetlands. And so they put provisions in that federal bill for conservation that highly erodible land and wetlands could no longer be in production. And it put the Soil Conservation Service employees into a role as kind of a regulatory enforcer role that they had never had before, because their role had always been technical assistance, education, and a limited financial assistance that grew over time. And so that caused a lot of angst in the organization, both the federal employees and the directors at the local level, that suddenly their clientele was being asked to do some things or having to stop doing certain things in order to stay eligible for federal conservation funds. So that was certainly a big change in the philosophy and carrying out conservation in Oklahoma. The Conservation Commission, I believe it was 87, when Congress amended the Clean Water Act that had been in place since 72, and they recognized that around the country we had not been addressing non-point source pollution, and much of the money had been spent to clean up municipal sewage plants, industrial pollution going into our water, but not enough. And great work had been done from 72 until the 80s in that area. There was huge investment in cleaning up point source pollution going into the water, but it was recognized that there was still a lot of pollution coming off the land, and that was non-point source pollution, and that needed to be better addressed. And Leonard Solomon had positioned the agency back early on to address agriculture non-point source pollution and because that's really what we did is erosion control on the land was prevented pollution from getting into streams from ag land. So, but in 1987, suddenly Congress decided to put serious money into non-point source pollution, and that really expanded our role as a water quality agency. And we hired technical staff, we set up a monitoring program, and I can't really say enough about the people that have worked in our water quality division over the years, their dedication. The monitoring program we set up, really second to none in the United States on the work we've done and the people that have managed that. But it all started in the late 80s, and the program continues to this day. I'm particularly proud of the Blue Thumb program that was started in Tulsa, and I believe one of our oral history collections, Cheryl Cheadle, was one of the principals in forming that program, and it's really a volunteer citizen scientist program where individuals are trained to monitor streams throughout the state, and the protocol is extremely important. They learn how to do it correctly, so all the information that was gathered by our Blue Thumb volunteers is usable as certified water quality data in the overall monitoring program. And I can't say enough about the folks that have run that program and the many volunteers that have participated in it now some 30 years. So that was a highlight. And then the other thing in water quality that is important is we started an implementation program where our staff, working with conservation districts, determined certain watersheds that had a lot of non-point source issues and provided cost share and incentive payments to producers to address those, and in targeted small areas that we could show an impact in reducing the pollutants from the land. And that's been a program that I'm particularly proud of as well. There's a EPA list called the 303D Impaired Waters of the State list that after we've determined where problems are, you address those watersheds. And we've been one of the most successful states in reducing the number of watersheds that have impaired conditions. So that's been a real positive that water quality program has addressed over the years. Then I think I'd like to share about the early 90s when the legislature, state legislature, wanted to consider consolidating many of the environmental and natural resource programs of the state. They thought that the state had too many overlapping agencies with jurisdictions. At the time, we had an agency called the Department of Pollution Control. We had the health department that did some things in the environment, the Water Resources Board, Wildlife Department, Corporation Commission, Conservation Commission. So there was a big move afoot to somehow streamline the environmental regulatory agencies, as well as some of the agencies like ours that was a voluntary based program. So it was a very contentious issue. There was everybody protecting their own turf. At the time, this was 92, I believe, or 91 and 2, and George Stunkard, who was serving as the state association president, so he was in the thick of all the meetings talking about what should happen to conservation and so on. And the long and the short of it was that the commission remained an independent agency. We received some specific new responsibilities, environmental education, coordinating that for the state. Our responsibilities in water quality and non-point source pollution were spelled out in the new law. We continued to be the Abandoned Mine Land Reclamation Agency. And conservation districts remained independent and working through the commission. And I believe that bill was passed in 92. It did establish the Department of Environmental Quality and dissolved the Department of Pollution Control, and the health department functions went over to DEQ. But it did line out responsibilities. But it was a wild time. There was one piece of legislation that wanted to consolidate our 80-plus conservation districts into 5 conservation districts, which made no sense at all to anyone. And so we had to do a lot of education of legislators on what we did and why it was important to keep the local structure. But that was a pretty wild time going through that whole legislative process. And Mason was the executive director at the time, and as I mentioned, George Stunkard carried the load for the Oklahoma Association of Conservation Districts. The next issue I should probably spend some time on is consolidation of conservation district offices. The history of conservation districts is that they were formed by petitions and votes of landowners back in the late 30s, 40s, and on into the 50s. And for that reason, there are places in the state where district boundaries are not on county boundaries. They were landowners that said, let's form a conservation district, and then maybe part of the county said, well, we're not ready to do that yet. And so instead of fighting that, they just drew boundaries on where they could make them happen. So when I joined the agency, there were 89 conservation districts, and as you know, there's 77 counties in the state. So that's always been a very confusing issue for legislators and the public is, well, why aren't conservation districts on county boundaries? Because many of them are. Many of them were formed as a county on a county basis. So when I joined the agency, the Soil Conservation Service provided staff to all 89 conservation district offices. But over the years, as we moved into the 90s, the USDA decided that they would have something called a service center where they would have one county office that the Soil Conservation Service, the Farm Service Agency, and the Farmers Home Administration would all be officed in the same building, which makes sense. You could come one-stop shop for all your services. Well, that forced the Soil Conservation Service to decide that they needed to close some 11 or 12 offices that they had staff in. And I got in the middle of this as the assistant director because Soil Conservation Service went out to local board meetings and said, sorry, but we're moving our staff from your office to the county seat where the service center is going to be, and you'll have to work with those employees through that office. And I would share one story that as a naive assistant director with about a year's experience, I accompanied the assistant state conservationist from the Soil Conservation Service to Okeen, Oklahoma, which was the office for the Cimarron Valley Conservation District, and their boundaries included parts of Blaine County and parts of Kingfisher County. And his job was to tell the board we're going to be moving our headquarters to Watauga, the county seat. And my job was to listen and suggest, would you all consider joining up with that conservation district, the Blaine County Conservation District, and maybe we could consolidate into one office. Well, there were a lot of people at the meeting in O'Keene, and one of the people in the audience that it invited was a young legislator named Clay Pope, which was my first time to ever meet Clay. And by the time the evening was over, I had a much better understanding of how difficult it is to consolidate offices. Much like school consolidations in Oklahoma, it's real easy to sit in Oklahoma City and say, boy, we have 500 some school districts. It's time we can't afford all of these extra administrative costs. We need to consolidate these rural schools. Well, when you go out to O'Keene, Oklahoma, and they have 2 conservation district employees that are in that town and 2 jobs in that town, it's kind of a big deal. And then you find out that, well, yeah, there's long-standing rivalry between O'Keene and the people of Watauga. And anyway, I learned a valuable lesson that no matter how logical I might make an argument about the need for consolidation, there were lots of other issues involved that would keep that from happening. And Mr. Pope, as I learned later, was a excellent debater. He'd been excellent communication skills, and his performance was virtuoso, and mine was less than impressive. And so I left that meeting with a new understanding of the difficulty of consolidation. And it remains a challenging issue for the agency and for districts, because there are lots of legislative folks that don't understand why there are more conservation districts than there are counties in the state of Oklahoma. Now let's move on to the late 90s. One of the major issues in the late 90s was the advent of corporate hog farming in Oklahoma. And there was quite an uproar about that, including the impact of animal waste on the environment. And Governor Keating set up an animal waste task force. Conservation Commission executive director was on that task force. It was, how do we address this issue? What do we need to do to protect the environment? And those were very interesting meetings as well. I didn't attend too many of them, but what did come out of it for the Conservation Commission was the need for the state to invest in conservation cost share for landowners with state funds. And so some 15 or 16 years from when we had initially thought about a state cost share program, this actually became part of the recommendations, and a bill was passed. And Clay Pope was in the legislature at the time. He authored the bill in the House that authorized the state cost share program. And beginning in the 1990s, late 90s, the Conservation Commission started this program. It's now run for over 20 years. The importance of that program is that it put money out to conservation district boards where they got to set the priorities of what practices they wanted that needed to be addressed in their district. And that was important because much of the federal conservation work that happened from the 85 Farm Bill up through the 2000 started being more multiple practices, whole farm sorts of proposals, which make a lot of sense, but they were expensive, and a lot of farmers might not be able to afford that kind of conservation. So by having a program that provided single practices, it gave district boards the opportunity to provide resources to their community. It's been a very I think, a very successful program. There's been millions of dollars now over the 20 years that have gone out on the ground for conservation that districts have been responsible for. And I would share one other story about this program that has stuck with me for a long time and goes back to district employees. When this bill passed and money was being appropriated by the legislature, the Federal Farm Service Agency administrator in Stillwater came to the legislature and lobbied that his federal agency should administer these funds locally. And some of what he said was that conservation district employees were not capable and didn't have the skill sets to administer such a program. And I can tell you that that's probably as mad as I have ever been in my political career, that a federal employee would come and lobby and use that as his rationale. And he directed all of his local employees to go to district board meetings and share why they should administer it. And that caused quite a fight. The legislature did not take him up on that proposal, and district employees from day one had administered the cost share program. But it was a wild ride putting out that particular fire. Okay. Also in the late 90s, excuse me, probably one of the highlights of my career was getting to work with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, but the Oklahoma Association Conservation Districts was the lead. Excuse me. We put together a conservation leadership program for district directors, which I was the coordinator for from the commission, and it brought together district directors from all over the state. We had a group of about 18 in the first class. It was kind of modeled after the OSU Ag Leadership Program in some ways. But we would go around the state. We met, I believe, 6 times over the year and a half, and went to and learned about natural resource issues in all parts of the state. So we had a session in the Panhandle. We had a session in Northeast Oklahoma about mine reclamation. We talked water quality. And we talked about watershed O&M, watershed dams. And I'm really proud of that program and the people that were involved. And since those first two classes were in the late 90s and the early 2000s, many of those folks have continued to be and have been leaders, officers in the state association. They've been commissioners. So it's very rewarding to see those folks develop and really take on leadership responsibilities in the state. So let me take another break at this point. I'm sorry. Okay, I would like to spend a few minutes talking about one of the most challenging issues for the Conservation Commission and conservation districts that will be a challenge for a long, long time, and that is taking care of something over 2,100 upstream flood control dams in the state of Oklahoma. Oklahoma has more USDA constructed upstream flood control dams than any other state. And the way these are managed is that they're constructed with funds from USDA and technical assistance and engineering. But once they're constructed, they become the responsibility of the local sponsor, which is usually a conservation district that has been responsible for getting the land rights. And so they are responsible for the daily operation and maintenance of those structures. And one of the things I've learned in my career was it's really fun for politicians and agency folks to build something and have a ribbon cutting, and everybody's excited about it. And certainly when these dams were built, that was the idea. Everybody was excited about it. And once they're in place, they operate really quite well for the most part for a number of years. But just like a house, they they need repair, maintenance, and rehabilitation from time to time. And most of our sites, a great majority of them, were built, these dams, in the 1960s. And so I talked to some of the early watershed pioneers, including Leonard Solomon, after he had retired. I said, so when we were building all these sites, did anybody ever talk about what happens 30 or 40 or 50 years down the line when there's lots of need for repair? And he just kind of laughed and said, no, that was never really a consideration. I'm not going to worry about that. And by the time I became the assistant director in the early 90s, a lot of these sites were now 30 or 40 years old. And without care and attention, many of these sites had issues that developed, whether it be lots of trees growing on the dam causing some structural issues, towers where the water drained down, the pipes becoming rusted and needing replacement. Any number of issues became apparent, and the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service didn't provide any funding to do any of those things unless it was a repair that they did based on an error in their design or something like that. Otherwise, it was the responsibility of the conservation district to keep these operational. And one of the challenges there was that there were many districts that really did not even have personnel. We didn't have enough personnel to even go out and monitor these sites. So it became an increasingly challenging issue. Districts do not have the ability to tax, to actually raise any revenue locally with funds that they can do the operation and maintenance and repair of these sites. So during Mason Mungall's time as executive director, this was one of the problems that he recognized and really worked hard to figure out a way that we could start better managing and operating these sites in conjunction with the conservation district. So Dan Siebert, who was the Conservation Programs Division Director and responsible for watersheds and working with districts about watersheds, he helped initiate with Mason the idea of starting to get some equipment and some personnel that could work with districts to do on-the-ground operation and maintenance of these sites, checking the towers when they were plugged up, taking trees off the slopes of the dams. And I must say that where that program has gone from the 90s to present, the amount of equipment that the legislature has helped fund, we've come a long way in addressing these issues on a day-to-day basis. But it is a challenging job. 2,000 sites is a lot to say grace over. With reduced personnel and not having personnel in some districts to be able to go out on site on a daily basis or a regular basis, it's a challenge. And I think the commission, through Mason and Dan's efforts and continuing today, have at least done a lot to keep these sites safe, to keep them operating as they're designed. But it is an issue that's not going to go away for the state of Oklahoma. These sites provide lots of benefits, but they're now in the 50, 60-year age or older, and they're going to take a lot of money and time and effort to keep them operating and keep people safe. One of the big events that occurred in the late 90s was Congressman Frank Lucas, who's from Cheyenne and who, I believe it was his grandfather, actually worked constructing some watershed sites in Roger Mills County. He knows more about watersheds than any other congressman for sure. He sponsored legislation to put money into rehabilitating watershed structures in the country. And that program has been very beneficial to the state. It's a cost share program. The state has to come up with part of the money for going in and redoing dams and pipes and towers and bringing them up to dam safety standards. And the congressman is to be commended for working hard to get that legislation passed and then working to get funding from the federal government to address these issues, because he knows more than really anyone in elected officials the importance of these structures and the challenge of keeping them operational. So that was a big and important piece of legislation that was passed in the late 90s. I should share that district boards have some real challenges with landowners on watershed sites. As land ownerships change, landowners may think that they've just inherited a beautiful lake or pond, a large pond on their place, and may not understand that it's actually, there's an easement, that there are certain things that they can and can't do on that property. We've had some really challenging legal cases. I believe Dan in his interview mentioned one in Leflore County where a home was constructed in the emergency spillway, causing the Attorney General's office to get involved to move it. Really a very contentious issue for the board to deal with. I would share the issue that I worked on, a legal issue that has some long-term ramifications. We had a situation in Lincoln County where there was a blue-green toxic algae bloom in the water of the upstream flood control lake, and the landowner alleged that his cattle died from drinking the water in that lake, and went to court saying that the local district had the responsibility not only of managing the dam and the flooding portion of its purpose, but also responsible for the water quality in that lake, and that he won a rather large settlement from the district for the loss of and damage to his lost livestock. And that case was litigated. We were very concerned that it would set a precedent that all of our districts would suddenly, with no jurisdictional authority, have to make sure that the water in all of these 2,000 plus lakes was safe. And so that was a very hard and difficult and expensive case and learning experience for all of us. But that was certainly a sobering one for district directors that had watershed structures in their local districts.
What was the outcome?
The outcome was that the landowner received a significant cash payment that had to be money that we had to, the district did not have the amount of money that he was awarded by the courts, and so we had to actually ask for funding from the state of Oklahoma legislature to pay this particular settlement. So it was a hard issue, and still gives me a lot of concern about the future and what district boards are going to have to deal with going forward, with particularly as land ownership changes and these kind of issues, environmental issues arise in these lakes. The other event that I remember clearly is in 2007. We had what is now known as Hurricane Aaron, an inland hurricane, came in and settled over Oklahoma and had torrential rains throughout much of west central and southwestern Oklahoma. And in Caddo County, in the Sugar Creek watershed, I don't remember the rainfall amounts, but they were unbelievable. We had one particular watershed dam damaged to the point that we thought we were going to lose the dam, that we was going to breach, and we had to declare an emergency. Folks downstream of the dam had to be evacuated. we had to try to lower the water in the dam. There was a big gash in the dam. Fortunately, the dam held, and it didn't actually break and breach, but it was certainly a sobering experience for all of us that on the importance of local boards and staff having an emergency plan in place that they could work with the county emergency management people. We could coordinate repairs on a quick basis, that we could do the things necessary to keep people safe, keep the roads open. It was a sobering experience, and the outcome of that event, the hurricane, and the incredible damage that was done in some counties, was that we used that at the commission and the state association to say we've got to invest in our infrastructure on flood control dams. That here's what can happen. We've got now lots of sites were damaged, not to the extent that this particular one was. So at the time, the state association executive director, Association of Conservation Districts, was Clay Pope. He had left the legislature and become an executive director of the state association. And he knew the legislative process and was a very incredible spokesman for conservation. And so we came up with the idea of having the legislature pass a conservation bond issue, which had never been done before, for $25 million. And those funds would be used to repair a lot of the damage that had been done by the inland hurricane on watershed sites. It would be used to match funds from the federal government from the rehabilitation and repair that Congressman Lucas had passed. It would repair some of the cost share practices on individual landowners, and there was also money in it to try to work with the city of Kingfisher that has historic flooding problems in their community. So I got to learn how bond issues work for the state of Oklahoma, and work with the bond advisor. And amazingly, we got the issue passed. And it should be noted that this bill also included bond money for the Native American Museum in Oklahoma City, and also some dams on the Arkansas River in Tulsa. And we didn't think much of it at the time. There was 3 different parts to this, but a citizen brought a lawsuit saying that that was unconstitutional to have all 3 of these separate subjects in one bond issue, and the Supreme Court agreed with it. So after all this work, it was thrown out. And it had to go back again the next legislative session, so there was about a year delay. But we, in fact, got the money. It was used to do significant repair and rehabilitation work on watershed sites, working with Kingfisher on some trying to buy some areas and move people out of their floodplains. So all in all, it was a historic moment. I can't say enough about Clay Pope and his ability to make that happen as the OACD executive director. Mike Thralls and Trey Lamb was the state association president at the time that this happened, and was helping lead the charge as well. So that was a big moment in conservation history, and it really moved us forward on repairing and rehabilitating our watershed sites. I think that's all I'll say about the watershed program. It's been a great positive for the state of Oklahoma. The benefits that it's provided are immense, but it's going to be a long-term conservation issue that someone's going to have to deal with for years into the future. So I think that brings me pretty much to the end of my career. And I will say that probably the most fun that I had in the last year or so that I was the assistant director was getting to work a little bit with the Dust Bowl film that was produced by Ken Burns. And Mr. Burns and his people interviewed many people from Oklahoma, primarily the Panhandle. And while I wasn't directly involved in that part of it, some of our conservation district folks helped identify some of the old timers that had actually experienced the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. And once the film was completed, the Burns folks wanted to have some community screenings of a part of the movie, and they thought it was important that we go out in the countryside and have these screenings and then have some discussion about current conservation issues. And they were working with OETA as the local affiliate to PBS. And they chose Oklahoma as the state they wanted to work in, even though the film covered Kansas and Colorado and New Mexico to some degree. So OETA was looking for sponsors on who could help them put on these screenings, and Clay Pope, who, as I mentioned earlier, was a communications genius and quite a spokesperson, got wind of this, and so he suggested to OETA that there is no one more appropriate to helping sponsor these community forums than conservation districts. And so I got to work closely with Clay and OACD and OETA. And we put on 6 screenings around the state. The Ken Burns folks put together about a 40-minute kind of highlight film of the 4-hour film that we could screen. And we selected Guymon, Woodward, Altus, Tulsa, Oklahoma City, and Stillwater for the screenings. Didn't really know how well this would go over, but it was just a wonderful experience because there were so many people in all these communities that wanted to view the film. And then we followed it up with a panel discussion of conservation issues in their area. And Clay chaired those and did just a marvelous job. And so it was a real highlight to the end of my career to get to participate in this, a very positive thing. And our group from OETA and OACD, the folks that worked on it, were nominated for a regional Emmy as a community in the community service category for the work we had done putting these screenings on. So in the end, we were selected as the winner of the Emmy for the regional Emmys, and I now have proudly an Emmy as part of my my awards from working in conservation. And I can say, looking back at my time in high school, I would probably have been selected as one of the least likely students to ever be awarded a television Emmy. But the film is really a fantastic piece of work. The interviews done with the folks that lived through the 30s in the Panhandle. I got to meet Pauline Hodges, who is an educator and lived in Beaver County and worked on our community screening. She was one of our panelists as a Dust Bowl survivor. And she worked with the Ken Burns people, making sure things were accurate. Getting to meet her and some of the folks that were in the film, we gave them some special recognition in Guymon. It was just a marvelous experience, and the film is such an important piece of Oklahoma history that I think can be used for years to come for people to really understand the magnitude of this environmental catastrophe, about what can happen when you don't treat the soil well, when you don't do the right things on the land, that there are repercussions that are just devastating. And so it's a wonderful piece of historical education for the state of Oklahoma. So I was proud to be a small part of that whole project. So it was a great end to my career, and about the last year or two that I worked. And I really do count that as one of the real highlights of my career. So The last thing I would say as we transition out of my career, right at the end of my time as assistant director, this whole new movement of soil health has started in Oklahoma. And I'm very excited about it because instead of just dealing with soil erosion from wind and water, we now have folks that are looking at how do we keep our soil healthy? How do we build back topsoil? How do we're now looking at looking at soil in a whole new way that I think is just a real transformative shift in the whole soil conservation movement. And I'm proud to have known in my career Jimmy Emmons, who has been the leader in Oklahoma of this whole movement, and is really a national leader in that. And some of the work that's being done now in soil health is going to be, I think, really critical to the future of conservation in Oklahoma and in our country. So, with that, I think I'll stop, Tanya, and I'll transition to the excitement I've had the last 4 years being part of the Conservation Historical Society. We formed this group. It's been now an organization for 4 years, but it was the brainchild some 6 or 7 years ago of Tom Lucas, who was an RC&D coordinator for the NRCS and ended his career as public information officer. He lives out at Woodward and really wanted to make sure we preserved the history of conservation in Oklahoma. And he, with a lot of effort, got the right folks together, and we've got an active organization now. And this oral history, as I mentioned in the opening, is one of our big projects. And another one that I'm particularly excited about is the Historical Society is digitizing thousands of black and white conservation photos that are located in offices all around the state and are going to be made available on their website to anybody that wants to access them. And I think both those projects are going to go a long way to preserving some of our conservation history. So that's been most rewarding, and it's given me the opportunity to continue to network and work with a lot of people that I worked with in my professional career. So it's been a great retirement project for me.
And you're currently the president.
I am currently the president of the board of the Oklahoma Conservation Historical Society. So I think I know what the last question you might have for me is.
We're not there yet, though.
Oh, we're not.
Can you place Oklahoma in the United States conservation history? Where does it fit?
Oh, that's a good question. Oklahoma has provided a lot of leadership in the overall conservation, soil and water conservation movement in Oklahoma. We're certainly a leader in the watershed program and upstream flood control. We had the first dam ever constructed in Cloud Creek and had a big celebration during my tenure when we celebrated the 50-year anniversary of that dam being completed. We had a first out in Roger Mills County, the first completed watershed with all dams constructed. So certainly in that area, we're really second to none. Being a Dust Bowl state, we've really transformed the landscape and gotten serious about erosion control and been, I think, one of the leaders there as well. I think we have a strong, one of the things that I should say that I'm most positive about when I've met with other conservation folks around the country is that we have had a very positive relationship with the Natural Resource Conservation Service staff. We've had an excellent working relationship. We've been on the same page. We've done great things together, and I learned that a lot of states just haven't been that way. There's a lot of friction, but we've had some truly wonderful state conservationists. I would mention my friend Daryl Dominic, who served as state conservationist for 5 or 6 years in the early 2000s. As a Native American of the Choctaw tribe, teaching me a lot about the tribes and their relationship with state and federal government and how we can work together, and how we needed diversity in our staffing and our boards. And Daryl was and is a committed conservationist. The current state conservationist, Gary O'Neill, couldn't be prouder of the work he's done, and working with him at the end of my career. Roland Willis was the state conservationist when I first started, and a great individual. So I would say that's one of the things that Oklahoma's I think I'm most proud of, is that we've always had made a strong case for working together and getting the job done. So anyway, that's those are well, environmental education. We didn't talk about that too much, but the commission and districts have done a great job in establishing outdoor classrooms for kids, and helping kids learn about the importance of the natural resources and the conservation of those. So.
And I guess soil health is
And soil health
rising to the
now,
top of
which
that.
I can't take any credit for, but it is. We are yes, we are a leader. As I mentioned, Jimmy Emmons as a national leader in that effort. So we have a proud history of conservation in Oklahoma since the Dust Bowl, and
one of our own is in DC, leading the charge. One of the Oklahoma's,
Kevin Norton, yes. Kevin recently retired, but yes, he was associate director of the Natural Resource Conservation Service in Washington, and
I didn't know he had retired.
yeah, one of the finest public servants I ever worked with. Just one of the most committed conservationists. So we've had some wonderful leadership both in NRCS and conservation district directors, and the commission staff that I've worked with. So proud of my career, proud of the people I worked with.
Anything you didn't get quite done that you wanted to get done?
One of the biggest challenges that I feel like I didn't accomplish was that there is, as the state becomes more and more urban, it is a real challenge to convince urban legislators and urban folks about the importance of conservation on the rest of the state. And our state is over 94 or 5% on private lands, and it's not like western states where they're public lands. We've got to work with landowners. We got to incentivize, we've got to educate, provide technical assistance, financial assistance to make things happen. And it was a challenge to working with the legislature to oftentimes convince them of the importance of investing in conservation, that it impacted urban folks as well as rural folks. And that's a continuing challenge, and I don't know how much progress we made there, but that was one area that we sure worked hard at trying to make that happen.
Sounds like a big challenge too was sharing the money, dividing. You had X dollars and so many people wanting it.
I didn't share with you that the Conservation Commission's budget was mostly state funds from the legislature appropriated for districts, and we were part of the Natural Resource Appropriation Group with other agencies like the Water Board and DEQ. And I learned early on that we were at the bottom of the pecking order when it came to dividing up state funds, because you have education, transportation, public safety and corrections, human services, and then, if there's any money left, we'll fund natural resources. So we were always challenged to make our case for appropriations. And then, yes, once we got money, we had to allocate it to the districts, and that was always a challenge because there were lots of districts that said, "Well, why does this district have 2.5 employees and we only have one? We do way more work than they do. They just waste that money." So there were those kind of tensions all the time on allocating funds, and we tried to do the best we could. Here's the workload, and here's the best we can do. But it was, yes, continuing challenge.
You got well skilled at keeping the peace.
I don't know how well skilled I was, but we tried to keep the peace as best we could.
Spent a lot of time on the phone.
Yes.
And
I would share, speaking of being on the phone, my young daughter, when asked one time what her father did at work, her response was, "He talks on the phone all day." So there's some truth to that, but yes, I did spend a lot of time on the phone.
And it wasn't a 40-hour-a-week job?
No, it was, there were lots of nights at board meetings on the road around the state, and taking one away from home. So, but the flip side of that is that I realized how many friends and people that I met all over the state that if I go to some little town in Oklahoma traveling through, there's somebody that I know there I can call up and say hello to. If I have my car breaks down, I know people in all parts of the state that I know and am networked with, and it's been a joy to be able to meet so many people. And I think I didn't share this in my interview, but we often talk about conservation family and taking care of each other. And one of the things that I would say is that whether it's an NRCS employee, a commission employee, a district employee, almost all the employees really have a heart for conservation and making things and actually accomplishing things on the ground. They feel there's a commitment there, and you certainly don't get rich working in conservation, but folks really are connected throughout the state. They're connected in their local communities on what they're doing. They're proud of what they do, and I think that was one of the most rewarding things about my career is just the commitment of folks at all parts of the partnership of getting the job done and knowing that they're doing good for the people of Oklahoma and good for the environment.
So you've traveled throughout the state. You've been in almost every county. You were saying all but one.
I've been in about every conservation office in the state over my career and traveled throughout the state. Yes.
Do you have a favorite spot?
I would never admit to a favorite spot here in an interview because it would offend somebody else. But
okay.
I will tell you that I gained a great appreciation for the Panhandle and the people that lived there through the Dust Bowl, the people that stayed. There's lots of folks, as they call us, downstaters, that make fun of the Panhandle or don't ever want to travel through there. But I can tell you that there are some wonderful people out there that I met and worked with through my career. And you can say that about lots of other parts of the state, that there have been hardships, but that one's certainly one that has stuck with me, is the challenges of those folks and the ones that stayed, and just the resilience of the folks out there. So yeah, that would be, I'd put them up there as a highlight of.
Were your grandparents that were on the farm still farming when you got into conservation?
No, this is kind of interesting in that my grandparents and my parents were living in Grant and Kay County during the Dust Bowl in the 30s. And I never had a discussion with my grandparents or my parents about their experiences in the Dust Bowl until I actually started working in conservation. And my grandparents by then were dead. And my mom actually then said, "Oh yeah, I remember being in Blackwell when the street lights came on in the middle of the day because the dust had made the sky so dark." And it's just like, well, we lived through that. It wasn't. She never made it a dramatic thing. It was like couldn't even hardly get the information out of her. So it's an appreciation of those folks. They lived through it and they dealt with it. And the depression was going on at the time, and it was just a remarkably difficult time. And it was a generation that just said, we lived through it. We're not going to make a big deal about it. But anyway, so yeah, that's kind of funny that despite their personal experiences, they never really shared that with me.
And then both children have gone into some aspect of environment.
I should brag on my two kids.
Yes,
I have a son and a daughter, and even though they saw some of the stress and strain on me as a father working in this job, they've chosen public service careers as well. And my son is Clean City Coordinator for the Association of Central Oklahoma Governments here in Oklahoma City. And my daughter works for the Department of Environmental Quality in their land restoration division. And so I'm quite proud of them. I sometimes wonder if in these days and times the public sector is the place to be, but they're doing well, and I'm proud of them. And I should say that I didn't share with you that my wife was one of the first women professionals to work at the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation. And it gave me a great appreciation in the 1980s of the challenge of being a woman in some of these fields, like conservation or natural resources, really any field. But so I think I had hopefully gained an appreciation for some of the women that we hired in our agency, that how they were viewed out in the field, that it was hard. It was a hard change to for a predominantly male organization to suddenly have women conservationists. So anyway, I gained that appreciation from my wife and her experiences working at the wildlife department, and hopefully was sensitive to and helped promote more and more women in conservation. And now, that was, I don't know when we had the first female district conservationist in NRCS in Oklahoma, but I'm guessing it was probably the 80s or 90s. So now that's just changed remarkably. There's at the Conservation Commission, I think half the management team is now female. So
and you were there when the first assistant director.
Yes, Mr. Solomon selected Carol Wofford to be an assistant director. So yes, she would have been the first female manager in the Conservation Commission in the 80s.
How was that received?
Well, there wasn't any issue in the office. Of course, we had a small office at the time, and she had worked there for a time. I don't know that I could speak to how it was received in the field, but certainly I'm sure it was a challenge for her with a lot of people at the time in that particular culture that we had.
So when you first started, you said there were about 10 people in the, and now it's what?
Well, at one point we had somewhere between 45 and 50 commission employees, either full and part-time, and I think it's a little bit less than that now. But yeah, I would say one of the things that I'm also proud of is the commission staff now has some folks, for example, in water quality, in wetlands, in conservation education, and in the watershed program that are as skilled and professional as any in NRCS or other agencies. That we developed a technical capability that certainly when I started, it was just an administrative agency. So I'm particularly proud of that fact that the people we have now that are our most capable professionals.
Well, on wetlands, you don't think of Oklahoma having wetlands. Did you have anything were involved with, like the red?
Well, I didn't
Slough?
mention, but I did have responsibility at some point in my career to help put together the wetlands plan for the state of Oklahoma, and I got to learn a lot about wetlands. That we do have a remarkable variety of wetlands from McCurtain County, where we have the Red Slough and some oxbow lakes, and we have alligators, to the Panhandle, where we have playa lakes that are important to migratory birds, and a lot everywhere in between McCurtain County and the Panhandle. So it's an interesting and important resource issue.
When it was time to learn about various things like this, where would you go? I mean, did you?
Well, yeah, I would certainly on wetlands. We worked with folks from the Fish and Wildlife Service. We worked with biologists from the Natural Resource Conservation Service. So yeah, we would partner with expertise in other agencies to try to get a broad perspective on things.
So do a lot of listening and
lots of listening
and
mm-hmm.
reading.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was. I had to spend a lot of time getting up to speed on wetlands and going out in the field and looking at different types of wetlands that we had. Yeah.
And who would you consider your mentor? I guess.
Well, the people that
Mason,
Mike Thralls, Leonard Solomon, we're all. I count them as mentors, friends, great professionals that I really looked up to. Yeah.
And when you walked out of the building for the last time, what was one?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, Tanya, because my last day physically in the office was New Year's Eve, 2013. And on New Year's Eve, there aren't many people left around at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They're either on vacation or getting ready. And so it was quite a sobering moment. As I left the building about 5 or 6 o'clock, it was getting dark, and I was the last one carrying out some boxes, turned out the lights, and it seemed appropriate because the next day was New Year's Day 2014.
So your last day, when we said 20?
My last day on the payroll was in 2014,
okay.
But my last day physically in the office was New Year's Eve 2013.
So I'm assuming they'd had a party earlier for you.
No, it was actually the week after. It was the first week of January when we had the retirement party. Yeah.
Okay. A good 30-something years, huh?
It was. It was a great year. Great career.
All right, then we'll finish with my last question. How do you want to be remembered, Ben?
Tanya, I've thought about this a lot, and I would really like to be remembered as a public servant that did the best I could for the state of Oklahoma and for the agency and for the conservation districts, and that with the ideal of stewardship and making something as good or better than you found it, that the state and the agency and the districts were a little bit better off when I left than when I came into it. So I think that's how I'd like to be remembered, that I did the best I could, and hopefully things were a little bit better when I left.
Okay. I think a lot of people would agree with you that you've been quite successful at that. So,
well, it's been a pleasure. And again, thank you to OSU for doing the Conservation Heritage World History Collection.
Well, thank you for finally sitting down to do it with me.
You're welcome.
Okay.